The question everyone asks when they hear what happened to me is some version of the same thing. Did you know? They don't always phrase it directly. Sometimes it comes wrapped in something softer. You must have had a feeling, they say, or didn't something seem off? But what they mean underneath the gentleness of it is, how does a woman spend 18 months with a man and not know that he has a wife? How does a person who is paid to notice things, trained to spot what other people miss, look at someone every week for a year and a half and not see what was right in front of her? I'm a vascular surgeon. I have been for 11 years. My job, in the most basic terms, is to find problems inside the human body that shouldn't be there and remove them before they can do irreversible damage. I work with millimeter margins. I work with vessels you could thread a needle through. I work in a world where not paying attention is the most dangerous thing a person can do. And yet, I've had a lot of time, in the months since everything came apart, to think about that question. I've turned it over the way I turn over a case file when something isn't adding up, looking for the detail I missed the first time, the thing I set aside when I should have looked at it more carefully. Here is what I've arrived at. After all that turning over, the answer is not yes and it is not no. The answer is something more uncomfortable than either of those. I noticed things. I noticed all of them. I cataloged them in that part of my brain that is always running, always looking for patterns. And then I made a decision, quietly, without even fully knowing I was making it, to assign each one the most generous explanation available. Because I loved him. Because I wanted to be wrong. Because I had spent 11 years being right about things in operating rooms, and I desperately wanted my personal life to be the one place where I could afford to be imprecise. That is the answer. I want you to hold it for the entire length of this story because everything that follows makes more sense. When you understand it, I am not a woman who missed the signs. I am a woman who saw them and chose, for a year and a half, to be kind to them. I'm going to tell you everything. And I'm going to be honest with you about the parts that don't make me look careful or smart or strong. Because I think those are the parts that matter most. Not the moments when I finally figured it out, but the months before that, when I had what I needed to know and kept myself from knowing it. This is not a story about how I was fooled. It's a story about what it costs to finally stop fooling yourself. I'm 39 years old. I have a small apartment with one very demanding houseplant and a kitchen I rarely use because most nights I get home too late to cook anything that requires more than 10 minutes. I have a handful of friends I genuinely love and almost never see. I have a mother who calls every Sunday without fail and a brother who texts in bursts of 5 messages at once and then disappears for a week. I have a career that takes up most of the space in my life, not because I lack imagination for other things, but because I built it that way, deliberately, over many years, and it has given me back exactly what I put into it. I became a surgeon because I am the kind of person who needs to know what she is dealing with. There is something about the clarity of it. The problem is here. The tools are these. The margin for error is this. That gives me a sense of order I have never found anywhere else. In the rest of my life, things are messy and ambiguous and often impossible to resolve. In the operating room, there is always an answer. You might not reach it in time, but it exists. I want to tell you about my father, because my father is part of this story even though he died 3 years ago and never knew anything about it. He was a cardiothoracic surgeon, 40 years of it. The kind of career that, from a certain angle, looks like a life fully lived. The saving of people, the skill accumulated over decades, the reputation that grew with it. From another angle, which is the angle I had as his daughter, it looked like a man who was present in the way that very important objects are present. Always there, always significant, never quite available in the specific ordinary way of a person who is just a person and not also a profession. He was not a bad father. I want to be precise about that. He was not cruel, not absent in the dramatic sense. He was the kind of father who didn't quite notice when something mattered to you. Not out of cruelty, but out of the specific unavailability of a person whose attention is perpetually claimed somewhere else. His best was given every day in the operating room. By the time he came home, there was less of it available, and I was old enough by the time I understood this to have already adjusted my expectations accordingly. What I inherited from him was the career. Not because he asked me to, not because I owed him a legacy, but because I genuinely wanted it. Because the thing that had taken him away from me was also, I understood eventually, the thing that made sense to me at the level where things make their deepest sense, the precision, the urgency, the specific way that skill and consequence combine in a space where they have to. What I also inherited, without meaning to and without noticing I had, was his particular approach to the rest of life, the part outside the work, the part where you're just a person. I treated the rest of life the way my father treated it, carefully, but without the same full weight of attention. Not dismissively, carefully, but always with the awareness somewhere underneath that the urgent thing was somewhere else. This was something I had inherited. And like most inherited things, I didn't fully recognize it as mine until I had lived inside it long enough to see its shape from outside. By my mid-30s, I had been in 4 relationships of varying seriousness, and what they all had in common was that they ended because the person I was with eventually got tired of being the third priority in my life, behind the hospital and the cases and the 3 a.m. phone calls and the canceled weekends. And I could not, on any of those occasions, look at the situation clearly enough to tell them they were wrong, because they weren't wrong, and I knew they weren't, and I still couldn't give them what they needed. The most significant of these relationships ended when I was 34. He was a trauma physician, and I had thought, genuinely believed, that being with someone who also worked in medicine would solve the problem. What I discovered was that 2 people who both use work as their primary method of self-organization do not cancel each other's unavailability, they compound it. We ended on a Sunday in February with the quiet resignation of 2 people who are too tired to fight and too honest to pretend. I had arrived, by the time I met Daniel, at a particular kind of peace with this. Not happiness, exactly. More like acceptance. I was very good at my work. I was useful in a way that mattered. I had friends, and my mother, and the houseplant, and a certain satisfaction in the life I had built, even if it was narrow in the way that lives built entirely around one thing tend to be. And then I met Daniel, and something happened that I had not anticipated. He fit. Not in the way that other people hadn't fit. Daniel fit in the deeper, harder to articulate way of someone who seemed to have been engineered for the exact shape of my life. He didn't need much from me. He understood from the very beginning that I wasn't going to text back quickly and that cancellations were going to happen, and that when I was in the middle of a difficult week, I would go quiet in the specific way I go quiet. Still present, still there, but not able to give anything beyond presence. He accepted all of this without making me feel guilty for it, without, as far as I could tell, minding it at all. I mistook that acceptance for understanding. I know now that it was something else entirely, that all the things I read as accommodation were actually architecture, the careful design of a man who needed his own space for the parts of his life he wasn't showing me. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The conference was in March, a medical technology summit, the kind of event where hospital administrators and software developers and clinicians all end up in the same convention center talking past each other for 2 days. I had been asked to present on workflow integration in the vascular surgery department, which was not something I would have agreed to if my department head hadn't made it clear that agreeing was in my interest. I had presented twice, attended 3 panels I mostly disagreed with, and was standing at the coffee station on the second afternoon when Daniel appeared beside me. He was not in medicine. This was already a novelty. He worked in healthcare administration software, implementation, he said, with the slightly self-deprecating tone of someone who has explained what implementation means many times. He helped hospitals figure out how to actually use the systems they had spent significant money buying. He was funny. This sounds small, but it wasn't. My world is not a particularly funny place. He made a remark about the conference coffee. Something about the specific cruelty of providing caffeine of this quality to people whose entire professional existence depended on clarity of thought. And I laughed in a way I hadn't in longer than I could immediately place. We talked for 20 minutes. He asked me actual questions about my work, not the surface ones I usually get from people outside medicine, but specific, curious questions about the challenges of operating on structures that small, about how the margin of error changes across surgical specialties. I asked him questions back. By the end of those 20 minutes, he had my number, and I had his, and I had said yes to the networking reception that evening, and I drove home feeling something I hadn't felt in a long time. Interested. Just straightforwardly, simply interested. Here is what 18 months with Daniel looked like from the inside. Tuesday evenings usually. He would come to pick me up at the hospital entrance. Not always. Sometimes he would wait in the car or text from the lobby, but more often than not I would push through those doors after a long shift and he would be there. Almost always with something. Flowers he had spotted on the way. A chocolate bar from somewhere specific. A book he had picked up because it reminded him of something I had said once. He listened the way doctors are supposed to listen, but often don't. Actually listening, not organizing his response while I was still speaking. He remembered things. Not just the obvious things, but the specific ones. That I found a particular colleague difficult to work with. That I had been trying to resolve a scheduling conflict for 3 weeks. That I had mentioned once, briefly, that my father had been a surgeon too, and that I had complicated feelings about that inheritance. He stored all of it and brought it back at the right moments, not in the way of a person performing interest, but in the way of a person who had actually heard you the first time. There is a particular intimacy in being heard. I had been so long in a life where I was mostly the listener, where my job required me to receive information and assess it and respond to it, where most of my personal relationships were with people who needed things from me. That being heard felt, to put it plainly, like being taken care of. Like someone had noticed I was tired and handed me a glass of water without being asked. I want to tell you about a specific Tuesday in October because specific ones are more honest than the general. It was about 4 months in. I had come off a difficult week. 2 procedures that had gone longer than expected. A complication in a post-op patient that had kept me at the hospital until nearly midnight on Thursday and again on Friday. I texted Daniel that morning to say I wasn't sure I was going to be very good company. He replied that he wasn't coming for my company. He was coming to make sure I ate a real meal. He arrived with groceries. Not wine, groceries. He had apparently decided, based on my text, that what was needed was not a restaurant order but something that required the kitchen, something that made the apartment smell like something was being made. He cooked while I sat at the counter with a glass of water and did not need to perform being fine. We had dinner, and he asked me about the complicated week, not in the way of someone who wants the story, but in the way of someone who wants to know how I actually was. I told him how I actually was. This is the thing I couldn't do with most people. The clinical language my brain defaults to when describing difficult cases, the specific weight of a complication that you anticipated and managed but that still leaves something residual in you. He received all of it without needing me to translate it into something easier to hear, without offering comfort I hadn't asked for. At some point, somewhere after 10, the apartment was quiet and we were on the couch with the television on at a volume that meant neither of us was watching it, and I fell asleep. I almost never fall asleep outside of my own bed. I woke up an hour later to find him still there, having apparently decided without discussion that waking me was not the right thing to do. He looked up when I stirred and said I had been completely out, and when I apologized, he told me not to apologize for sleeping, that it meant I was comfortable, that specific thing. That is the texture of what I thought I had. There was a Saturday in January, one of the coldest Saturdays of that winter, the kind of cold that empties outdoor markets of everything except the vendors who have nowhere else to be, and the regulars who've made the trip often enough that the routine has its own momentum. I had almost suggested we skip it. Daniel said he wanted to go, that he wanted to check whether the honey vendor had the winter variety she had mentioned weeks before. He had remembered something she had said in passing 3 weeks earlier, in a conversation I had been present for but had not retained. She had mentioned a small batch of honey made from late-season wildflowers that she was jarring over the winter and would have available in January. He had noted it. He had wanted to go back for it. The vendor remembered him. She lit up slightly in the way that vendors do when a customer demonstrates actual attention, not just willingness to buy, but genuine interest in the thing being sold. She produced a jar from under her table that she hadn't put out yet, one of the last from the batch, and explained it with the same specificity she always brought to these conversations, and he listened the same way he always listened. I stood beside him holding the coffee we'd bought on the way, and I felt something I registered as happiness, the uncomplicated kind. The kind you don't question in the moment because there seems to be no reason to. I understand now that the attention Daniel brought to the honey vendor, to the wine shop, to the specific coffee in a kitchen that was not his, all of it was the same skill applied to different surfaces, the skill of noticing what matters to someone and using it to make them feel seen. He was very good at it. He was good at it with me. And he was good at it in the other direction too, which is to say, he was practiced enough to maintain 2 separate lives for longer than I have been willing to think about in one sitting. The honey is still in my cabinet. Both jars from that January, unopened. I bought them because he knew I would like them, and I wanted to prove him right. They have been there for 11 months, and I keep seeing them and thinking, not yet, and then closing the cabinet, maybe this year. Honey keeps for a long time. Then there was a Tuesday in April, about 7 months in, when I waited outside the hospital longer than usual. I stood at the entrance for 30 minutes, watching cars come and go, telling myself he had gotten stuck in traffic, not worried exactly. just aware of the waiting, which is not something I normally allow myself to notice. When he finally arrived, he was slightly out of breath, carrying a large gift bag, apologizing before he had even finished walking toward me. He told me he was so sorry, that he knew he was late, that he had been finishing something he had wanted to bring. Inside the bag was a complete collection of skincare products, serums, moisturizers, things I would not have known how to choose for myself because I wouldn't have known where to start. I had said something to him once, weeks earlier, almost in passing, that I wanted to start taking better care of my skin, but had no idea what I was doing. I had forgotten I had said it by the time I finished saying it. He had not forgotten. I stood there at the entrance of the hospital holding that bag, and I completely forgot I had been waiting 30 minutes. Just gone. Replaced by something warmer and slightly disorienting, the feeling of being seen by someone paying a quality of attention I hadn't known was possible in this specific kind of way. I couldn't believe how much he noticed. I still can't, in a very different way, now. The weekends were less regular than the Tuesdays. Some weekends he spent at my apartment, and those were the weekends I loved most. We developed the kind of rituals that form between two people who have found a comfortable rhythm. The Saturday morning coffee made a specific way, the walk to the farmer's market 3 blocks away, the specific comfortable silence of two people who have stopped needing to fill every gap with words. Other weekends he was traveling for work, and this I accepted without question. Healthcare software implementation doesn't keep office hours. I had more than enough to fill my own weekends, and his absences had never felt like absences so much as the natural breathing room of two people with full lives. I accepted all of it so completely that I never once, not once in 18 months, sat down to think about the specific shape of his schedule, the rhythms inside what he described as an irregular life. If I had, I might have noticed that his availability was not as irregular as he described, that there was a structure to it, a consistency that, looking back now, looks less like the unpredictable demands of an implementation consultant and more like the careful maintenance of a man whose time was divided between 2 separate places in a way that required constant management. But I didn't sit down to think about it, because he had never given me a reason to. I want to tell you about his apartment. He lived 45 minutes away, far enough that the commute was inconvenient on weeknights, close enough that a weekend was manageable. We spent most of our time at mine, for practical reasons. But I went to his place too. 8 times I counted afterward. I remember the first time clearly. He had cooked dinner, and the apartment had smelled like something was almost ready when I walked in. It was a nice apartment in the way of furnished places that have been carefully selected to feel like someone's specific taste while actually being the taste of no one in particular. Clean lines, neutral tones, a coffee table book that was too large to be useful. The kitchen was well stocked. There was wine in the refrigerator, the specific bottle I had mentioned once in passing. I thought he prepared. I thought he wanted this to be good. On the 3rd visit, sitting at his kitchen table, I noticed the dish soap was different than it had been the first time. A different brand, a different scent, sitting in the same spot beside the sink. I noticed this in the automatic way. I noticed things and assigned it to the category of, he restocks differently than I do. Different brand each time. I did not think more about it. The kitchen supplies were different on the 5th visit. And on the 7th, each time I noticed. Each time I moved on. I know now what those visits actually were. 8 stays in a fully furnished corporate apartment that he rented on a rotating basis through a short-term rental platform. The kind of place that caters to long-term business stays, that has everything a home has, because for the people who normally rent it, it functions as one. He had added the personal details himself, the specific coffee, the wine, the book on the table, just enough individual texture to read as a person's space and not a rental. He paid cash for some of the stays. I found this out later. He paid cash. There were other small things in the months that followed. A moment in November when his phone buzzed and he picked it up with slightly more urgency than I was used to, typed something quickly, set it down, and was somewhere else for about 3 minutes before returning to the conversation with the same warmth he always brought. Not an absence most people would detect. But I have spent 11 years reading the texture of people's presence, and I felt the 3 minutes. I assigned it to something came up at work. I moved on. There was a moment about 4 months before everything, late in a quiet evening when we were talking about the future in the vague, comfortable way we sometimes did, and he said he had been thinking that what we had worked well, that he thought it could keep working for a long time, not grow into something, not become something, keep working. as though what existed between us, exactly as it was the thing he wanted to protect, a structure to maintain, not a foundation to build on. Something moved in the back of my chest when he said it, not quite unease. More like, I have heard the right words in a slightly wrong order, and I cannot tell yet why that matters. I set it aside. A few months later, I stopped being able to set things aside. It was a Thursday in June, the 19th. I know the time, 6047 in the evening, because I have since gone back to look, the way you go back to the moment in a case history where the trajectory changed. I had come home earlier than expected. A late surgery had been cancelled, a rare gift from a Thursday, and I had stopped for groceries on the way home and was standing in my kitchen unpacking them with the specific pleasure of a person who is home before dark for once. There was still light coming through the window above the sink. That detail has stayed with me. The quality of that specific evening light, ordinary and golden, and entirely indifferent to what was about to happen inside it. My phone was on the counter. I saw it light up with a name I didn't recognize. Christine Holt. I didn't know anyone named Christine Holt. The name had no association, no prior context. I almost didn't open it. I was in the middle of putting away produce. But something made me set down the bag of apples and pick up the phone. The message was 3 sentences. My name is Christine Holt. I am married to Daniel Holt. I think you should know this. I read it 3 times, standing at the kitchen counter with the apples in my hand, in that specific evening light. Then I set the phone face down on the counter, very carefully, the way you set something down when you don't fully trust your own hands, and I stood there looking at the apples. I want to tell you what happened inside me in that moment, and I want to be honest about it. It was not shock. Not the sharp intake of breath, not the sudden sense of the floor shifting. What arrived instead was something quieter and in its own way, more terrible. A kind of settling. Like something that had been suspended in solution for a long time had suddenly crystallized into a definite shape. Oh, there it is. I had never let myself think that thought before, but it arrived with the specific authority of something that had been waiting for a door to walk through. I picked up the phone and I replied, asking her to explain more, telling her I didn't understand. She never responded. Not that night, not the following day, not in the weeks that came immediately after. What I did instead, in the hours that followed her message, was what I do with new information and no context. I gathered more information. I started with his full name, Daniel Holt. I had never, in 18 months, put his full name into a search engine. I know how this sounds. But when you are the kind of person who extends trust as a default, who has never needed to investigate the people she lets into her life, searching someone's name feels like a gesture of suspicion. And I had given him nothing that required suspicion, until 3 sentences from a stranger told me I had been wrong. I searched. The results appeared in 2 seconds. He existed in the ways he had described. A professional profile, a company, a role in healthcare software. All of it consistent with what he had told me. The location was wrong. His professional profile listed a city 4 hours from mine, a different state. A city he had never once mentioned. I searched that city for his name and found a property record, a house registered in 2 names, his and Christine Holt's. He owned a house with his wife in a city 4 hours away. I put the phone down. I walked to the window. The light outside had shifted from gold to gray without my noticing. The street below was ordinary and ongoing, people walking dogs, a child on a bicycle, the world entirely unaware. And I stood there for a while and I thought about the apartment, his apartment. The place I had visited 8 times and believed was his home. I typed the address into a search engine. The first result was a short-term rental listing, fully furnished, monthly rates available, business district location. The photos were familiar. The kitchen, the living room furniture, the bathroom with the specific tiles I had stood in front of and noticed. All of it, identical, available for someone else to book starting next week. I looked at the photos for a long time. Then I went and sat on my couch and I did not move for a while. At some point that evening, his name lit up on my phone. A message asking how my day had been, saying he had been thinking about me. I did not reply. That night I went through everything I could find, not with drama, with the specific methodical attention I bring to a difficult problem. I looked at his professional history, his company's registered address, the conference guest list archived on the event website where we had met. He had traveled to that conference from the other state. The man who had appeared beside me at the coffee station had already been living the life I was about to discover. I thought about the times across 18 months when something had not quite added up, and I placed them alongside everything else. The regularities inside his supposedly irregular schedule. The 4 times I had been aware of him using cash for things he would normally put on a card. The soap changing in the apartment. The 3 minutes in November. The word keep. All of it crystallized that night into something I could not unfocus once I had seen it. I did not sleep much. By morning I knew what I was dealing with. I went to work Friday, and I moved through the day the way I move through difficult days, completely present in the room, completely elsewhere inside. In the hospital, I was exactly what I needed to be. In the minutes between, the question ran on a loop in the back of my head. A question, not a statement. Not how did I not see it? How did I not see it? I knew the answer and I did not want it. Because the answer was not that the signs were invisible. The answer was that I had seen them and had chosen every time the interpretation that let things stay as they were. He was coming that evening. We had planned to spend the weekend together. He did not know I knew anything. I let him come. I needed to see his face. He arrived just after 7 with his weekend bag, the same one he always brought, wearing a jacket I recognized. I opened the door and he smiled at me, the way he always smiled. That specific warmth that was the first thing I had noticed about him at the conference, still exactly as it had always been, and I stepped back to let him in. He came inside, set the bag down near the hallway, and started to say something about the traffic, and I waited until he turned around. Then I told him I had received a message the day before from a woman named Christine Holt. He went completely still. I want to describe that stillness because I think it matters. It wasn't the stillness of a person who has just heard something confusing and needs a moment to process it. It was the stillness of a person who understood immediately exactly what was happening and was deciding, in real time, how to respond. His eyes were open and his face was perfectly composed, and he did not move for several seconds. Then he asked what she had said. Not who she was, not where this was coming from. He asked what she had said. And in that question I heard the shape of the whole thing. The need to assess how much I had before committing to a version of events. I told him what she had said. The silence that came after was of a different quality than the one before, longer. The silence of a man doing calculations. And then he said he should have told me. Those were his exact words, and I want you to hear them carefully. He should have told me, not that it wasn't true, not that she was mistaken. He said he should have told me. 4 words that accepted the fact while quietly reframing him as someone who had made an error in judgment rather than someone who had constructed a deliberate and elaborate lie and maintained it every day for a 1.5 years. He told me they were separated. That word, specifically, separated. Living apart, he said. Though she was still in the house, though the legal process had not been finalized yet, though things had been complicated, he said he had been waiting for the right moment, that he had not wanted to drag me into something that was unresolved, that he had been trying to protect me. I let him talk. I watched his face while he talked, the way I watch faces in consultation rooms when I need to understand not just what someone is saying, but what they are not saying. And when he finished, I told him I had found the house, that I had looked up his name and found a property registered in both their names in a city 4 hours away. He said the separation was not legal yet, that she had been making things difficult, that he had been handling it. I said he had 2 children. He said yes. I asked how old. 11 and 8. I held those numbers for a moment. An 11-year-old and an 8-year-old whose father had spent the last 18 months constructing and maintaining something in another city that their mother had now found out about. I thought about what they were about to walk into. Then I told him the apartment was an Airbnb, that I had found the listing, that it was available for someone to book right now. That was the moment. Not Christine's name, not the property record, not the children. The Airbnb was what broke through the composure. For the first time in that conversation, something shifted in his face that was not controlled. Just a fraction of a second. The specific expression of a person who discovers that a wall they believed was solid has a door in it that someone found. He said he could explain that too. I said I was sure he could. That I was sure he could explain absolutely everything. But that I only wanted to know one thing. Just one. Whether anything at all about the last 18 months had been real. What he said next, I believed. I want you to understand that. I believed it, and I still believe it, and it does not change a single thing. He said what he felt for me had always been real. That had never been in question. I think he meant it. I have thought about this many times since that night. I believe it is possible for a person to feel something genuinely and still have built a life that makes the feeling insufficient, that makes it, in the end, beside the point. Those two things can exist at the same time, the genuine feeling and the life that makes it irrelevant. He said he did not want to lose me, that what we had was worth fighting for, that the situation with Christine could be resolved, that if I gave him the chance to explain properly, I would understand that this looked worse than it was. I picked up his bag from the hallway and held it out to him. He looked at it, and then at me, and then he asked if he could stay so we could keep talking. I said no. He stood there for a moment longer, and in the silence of that moment I saw something that I had never seen in his face before. Not remorse, not quite, but the specific expression of a person who has understood that a version of his life they considered safe is no longer available. And then he took the bag, and he walked out the door, and I closed it behind him. I stood in my hallway for a while after he left. Then I picked up the phone and I called my mother. She answered on the second ring. It was late on a Friday. She doesn't keep early hours. I said I needed to tell her something. She said okay, she was there to tell her, that's all. No questions before I was ready, no shift in her tone that would require me to manage her reaction before I had finished giving her the information. Just, I'm open, go. I talked for a long time. I told her all of it. Christine's message, the property record, the Airbnb, what I had found that night and that morning, the way he had stood in my hallway and what his face had done when I mentioned the listing. I told it in the order it had happened without shaping it into something easier to hear. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she asked if I was physically okay. Not how could he, not I never trusted him, not anything that required me to respond to her feelings before I had finished with my own. She asked if I was physically okay, because she has known me for 39 years and she knows that my version of not being okay does not always look the way other people's does. I said yes. I said I was at home. I said I hadn't eaten dinner. She told me to go eat something and that she would stay on the phone. So I went to the kitchen and made scrambled eggs. The simplest thing I could think of. The thing I make when my hands need something to do. And she talked to me while I made them. Not about Daniel. About other things. A book she had been reading that she couldn't put down. My brother's ongoing and apparently doomed attempt to grow tomatoes on a balcony that faces north. The kind of conversation that says, I am not going to make this larger than you can hold right now. I am going to sit here with you in the ordinary until you find your footing. I ate the eggs. I felt marginally more located in my own body, which was what I needed. At some point she asked what I needed from her, not what I was going to do. Not what she thought I should do, what I needed from her. The question of a person who has understood that her role right now is not to direct but to follow. I said I didn't know yet, that I thought I needed a few days to understand what I was looking at before I could decide what to do with it. She said she would call the next day, not to push, just to check. She called the next morning, and every morning that followed, for weeks. Christine did not reply to my follow-up message. 2 weeks of silence from her. What came instead in the third week was a call to my mother. My mother told me quietly, the way she tells me things she knows are going to land hard, a woman named Christine had called her that morning. That she had been in tremendous pain. That was evident in every word. And that some of what she had said about me was not true. I pieced together Christine's situation over the weeks that followed. She had found out about me 3 months before she sent that first message. A restaurant receipt in the pocket of one of his jackets. From my city, on a Tuesday. A charge for 2 people at a restaurant he had never mentioned visiting. She had spent those 3 months investigating in silence, the same way I had that Thursday night, while still living in their house, still parenting their children, still performing the continuity of a family that was privately dismantling itself from the inside. I understood why she was in pain. And I understood, on some level, why I was an easier target than he was. I was the stranger. She could be furious at me without the fury destroying something she was still, at some level, trying to hold together. He was the father of her children. I was nobody. But understanding why someone does something and accepting what they do are 2 different things. What followed over the next 6 weeks was something I had not prepared for. Christine began finding the people around me. A colleague at the hospital received a message from her implying she had information relevant to my professional conduct. Someone I had dated briefly years ago texted me, confused and slightly unnerved, to say a woman he didn't know had contacted him about me. A comment appeared on a professional networking account I barely used, meaningless to anyone who didn't know the context but intentional, the mark of a person leaving a mark. I deleted it. The next day there was another one. 6 weeks of that. I want to be clear, what she was doing was wrong. Her grief was real. Her anger at him was completely warranted. But redirecting that anger at the woman who had also been deceived. at the person who had no more power to have prevented this than she did, was not justice, it was displacement. There is a specific kind of cruelty in being the surface onto which someone else's pain lands, when you were not the one who caused it. My mother had already said directly to Christine what needed to be said, without flinching, the day Christine called her, and a lawyer helped me do something formal about the rest. The cease and desist letter went out on a Thursday in August. The harassment stopped within 2 weeks. In the days and weeks that followed, I moved through everything with a quietness that surprised me. The strange thing about that period was the absence of drama. The letter had been sent, Daniel had been blocked, Christine's messages had stopped, and I was left standing in the middle of something that had completely changed shape, with nowhere to put any of what I was carrying. The days moved slowly, the way time moves when something inside you is still processing even though everything outside is functioning normally. I was in the hospital, in surgery, doing exactly what needed to be done, and still the hours felt like they were moving through something thick. I kept catching myself in the middle of a procedure thinking, how did I not see it? The hands completely steady, doing the work, and that question running underneath without pause. How did I not see it? The answer I kept arriving at, which I didn't like but couldn't avoid, was this, because it was too good to be true and I chose not to notice that. I wanted what he offered to be exactly what it appeared to be. I chose to take it without questioning it. That was the truth I had to sit with. Not that I had been deceived, but that I had been willing, that I had, in some specific way, needed to be willing. I went to work every day of that period. Not out of heroism, out of necessity. There are patients with surgery scheduled, lives that depend on something I am the only one there to do, and those people do not wait while I process a personal situation. The work got me out of my own head for hours at a time, and I took that relief every time it came. But I was not talking to anyone about what was happening. My mother knew the broad shape of it. But in the hospital, with colleagues, in the ordinary texture of the day, nothing. I was carrying something that nobody around me knew I was carrying, and there is a specific kind of loneliness in that. Not the loneliness of being alone, the loneliness of being surrounded by people who are interacting with a version of you that is only partially there. At some point in the middle of that first week, I stopped feeling much of anything at all. Not as a decision. It arrived the way a body's defenses sometimes arrive, automatically, when the input exceeds what can be processed in real time. A flat, functional quietness. I moved through the days. I did my work. I ate at reasonable hours. I went to bed. I was waiting to cry, and it wasn't coming. Then one night, about 10 days after the cease and desist letter had gone out, I came home from a late shift, and instead of showering and going to bed, I started cleaning my bedroom. I have no explanation for this. There was no reason to clean it. I just started moving things, wiping surfaces, going through a corner I had been meaning to sort for months. And then I found it. A shirt. His shirt. One we had both looked for one Sunday morning, going through the apartment together trying to find it before he left. We had given up eventually and laughed about it, and he had said he would grab it next time. We never found it. It was folded in the back of a drawer, underneath some things of mine. Folded the specific way he folded things, which is different from how I fold things. And before I could decide anything about how I felt or what it meant or what I was supposed to do, I could smell him. I sat down on the floor next to that drawer and I cried in a way I had not cried in weeks, not quietly. The kind of crying that simply happens to you, that you cannot curate or control, that does not ask permission. I cried for a long time on the floor of my bedroom, holding a shirt that smelled like someone who was not who I had thought he was. When it was over, when there was nothing left, I felt something I had not felt in 10 days. Not okay, not better, just real. Like I had come back into my own body after a long stretch of operating from somewhere slightly outside it. I put the shirt in the trash. I finished cleaning the room. I went to bed. That night I slept properly for the first time in days. Here is the thing nobody prepared me for. I had been through difficult things before. I had ended relationships and I knew what that grief looked like. The specific shape of missing a person you chose to stop being with. The absence that is its own presence for a while before it becomes ordinary space. I had lost my father 3 years before any of this, and I knew what that grief looked like. The permanent, rearranging kind that does not resolve so much as slowly incorporate itself into who you become. What I was carrying after Daniel was neither of those things. It did not have a clean name. And the absence of a clean name made it harder to carry because we are all better at holding things we can name. What I lost when I lost Daniel was not a person exactly. The person I had loved. The one who remembered which wine I liked, who showed up on a Tuesday with food from the right restaurant, who noticed when I was tired and handed me a glass of water without being asked. That person existed. He was real in the sense that I could reach him and he would reach back. The care was real, or it was something functionally indistinguishable from real. The deception was not in the small kindnesses. The deception was underneath them, and that is what took me the longest to understand, because it means the truth is more complicated than he was a liar and I was deceived. The truth is that he was, in his specific way, genuine with me, and he was also running another life simultaneously, and the running of that other life made the genuineness beside the point. Those two things existed at the same time. I had to learn to hold both without letting one erase the other. What I actually lost was the story I had been living inside. And losing a story you believed in is a particular kind of grief because it retroactively alters everything that happened within it, not the things themselves. The Tuesday evenings were still what they were. The honey vendor still remembered him. The October when he cooked and I fell asleep on the couch was still what it was. But the meaning shifts when the context shifts. Everything I had understood as evidence of something real became evidence of something else, and that reframing does not happen cleanly or quickly. There is no ceremony for this kind of loss. When you lose a relationship, there is a framework. When you lose a person to death, there is a framework. When you find out that a relationship was real for you and constructed for someone else, you are grieving something that was, in the most technical sense, never fully what you thought it was. And there is no framework for that. You are holding something that does not fit in any of the available containers. People said, "At least you found out. At least there were no shared assets, no children, no legal entanglement." All of this was true, and none of it touched the specific thing I was carrying, which was the loss of a version of my own life that I had quietly started to organize around another person's presence. I had been in the territory that precedes love, that space where you start restructuring your sense of the future around someone without quite naming what you're doing. And what I lost was not just him, but that version of myself, the one who had found room, who had stopped being so carefully contained. She felt very far away for a while. About 6 weeks after Christine's first message, I had a long day at the hospital that ended in a strangely empty afternoon. Nothing scheduled, no follow-ups, just open time. I came home. The apartment was quiet in a way that had become a different kind of quiet than it used to be. Before, the quiet of my apartment had been neutral. After, the quiet had a shape to it, the specific shape of an absence. I watered the houseplant. I stood in my kitchen for a while. And then I sat down on the kitchen floor. Not for any particular reason, just because the floor felt like the right distance from everything. And I cried for a long time. The inarticulate kind. The kind that does not have words inside it, only weight being released in the only direction it can go. My mother called in the middle of it, the way she does sometimes, with the timing that is either coincidence or the attunement of a person who has been paying close attention to you for 39 years. I answered because I always answer. She asked how I was. I told her I was on the kitchen floor. She said she could be there in 40 minutes. I told her she didn't have to do that. She said she knew she didn't have to. She was there in 35. She did not say much when she arrived. She came in and put the kettle on, and she sat down on the kitchen floor with me, which is not a small thing for a 64-year-old with a bad knee and a preference for chairs. She sat there until I was ready to get up. And when I was ready to get up, she held me up, and she made the tea, and she stayed until I fell asleep. I want to name this clearly because it matters. This is what the family that protects you looks like. Not a dramatic entrance, not a devastating speech. It looks like arriving in 35 minutes when you say you're on the kitchen floor, and sitting down there with you and making tea and staying until you can sleep. That is protection. It is quiet and it is not cinematic, and it is the thing that actually helps. I started therapy 3 months after everything happened, which was longer than I should have waited. I am a person who understands the value of therapy theoretically and resists it in practice in the specific way that people who spend their careers managing other people's crises tend to resist it when the crisis is their own. The therapist my mother found did not try to move me to a feeling I hadn't arrived at yet, which was the only quality I required. What emerged from those sessions slowly was not primarily about Daniel. It was about a question I had not been honest with myself about. Why had the arrangement felt so much like relief? What was it about someone who required so little of me, who was present but always within limits, available but never fully there, that had felt like exactly what I needed? The answer I arrived at slowly, across many weeks, was this. I had been looking, without knowing it, for someone who would not require me to change the balance I had established. Someone who would accept the version of me I had built around the work, who would not need more than I had available, who would, without asking, give me permission to receive without having to restructure everything to do it. Daniel had provided exactly that, because he had reasons, which I did not know, why he could not ask for more. We had been, in some specific and terrible way, a perfect fit for the wrong thing. That was the part that took the longest to make peace with. Not that he had deceived me, that I had been looking for the kind of connection that made the deception possible. I want to be clear about something. I am not responsible for what he chose to do. The deception was his. The choices were his. Being trusting is not the same as inviting betrayal. Being willing to extend generous interpretations is not the same as consenting to be lied to. But understanding yourself, understanding the shape of what you are looking for and why, that is work worth doing, not to punish yourself with it, to make different choices going forward. I am still making those choices. Some of them are still hard. It has been 11 months since Christine's 3 sentences arrived while I was putting away apples in the kitchen light. Daniel and I have not spoken. He is somewhere in the consequences of what he built and what he let collapse, and I have made a deliberate choice not to track where that is. Not because I don't sometimes want to know, because wanting to know is not the same as needing to. Christine and I have not spoken either. The harassment stopped and has not returned. I have thought about her more than she probably knows. Not with anger, which has mostly resolved into something quieter, but with the specific way you think about someone who was hurt by the same person you were, for longer, in ways that went deeper, with consequences that will reshape everything going forward. I don't know what her life looks like now. I hope she has someone who sits on kitchen floors. The houseplant is thriving. I repotted it in September, something I had been meaning to do for 2 years, and it put out 3 new leaves in October. Recovery looks like that. Like the ordinary thing you had been postponing getting done. I started cooking more. Not as a metaphor, just actually cooking, making real dinners instead of eating standing at the counter. My mother came for dinner twice in October. We cooked together in my kitchen, which we hadn't done since I was a child, and it was exactly as good as I remembered. Which is the kind of discovery that makes you wonder what else you've been missing by not making time for it. The honey jars from the January farmer's market are still in my cabinet. Both of them, unopened. I see them sometimes and think, not yet. And then I close the cabinet, maybe this year. I want to say one more thing because I think it would be dishonest to end without it. Christine was hurt in ways that go deeper and longer than anything I experienced. Her husband, the person responsible for both our situations, moved through all of it with the same management he brought to everything difficult. The ability to reorganize a narrative around his own survival is the skill that made 18 months of deception possible, and it is probably the same skill that makes what comes after survivable for him. I have no power over that. I made peace with having no power over that, and that took longer than anything else in this story. What I do have power over is how I carry it, what I bring to the next version of my life that includes it. Whether the 18 months become a reason to close things off or a reason to understand something I hadn't understood before. About myself, about what I want, about the difference between being contained and being safe. There is a version of this story that ends with the villain punished and the lesson learned, and the survivor standing in clear light on the other side, intact and certain. This is not that version. This is the version where I tell you that the person who hurt me is also, in his specific way, a complicated person who felt things genuinely while doing things that caused tremendous harm, and that those two facts are not in contradiction, and that holding them simultaneously without letting either cancel the other is the actual work of understanding what happened. The lesson is not be more suspicious. The lesson is not trust no one. The lesson is smaller and harder than either of those. The lesson is stay honest with yourself about what you are seeing, even when what you are seeing is uncomfortable. Be generous with people. Extend the kindest interpretation available. And also, look at the data. Let the data tell you things. Don't assign evidence to categories that protect you from what the evidence is actually saying. Those two things, the generosity and the looking, are not opposites. They are harder to hold together than either one is alone, but they are both necessary, and neither works right without the other. I am a vascular surgeon. I work in millimeter margins. I know what it costs to miss something small. The operating room taught me that. And so, in its way, did Daniel. My hands were steady through all of it, not because it didn't hurt or scare me or leave something altered in me that I am still learning the shape of. My hands were steady because steadiness, for me, is not the absence of feeling. It is the presence of a commitment to continuing anyway. I am continuing. This is what continuing looks like. If something in this story reached something in you, if you recognize the 18 months, or the setting aside, or the specific grief of losing a story that has no clean name, leave it in the comments. You don't have to say much. Sometimes just knowing that someone else has stood in the kitchen light and read 3 sentences that changed the shape of everything and chose to keep going. Sometimes that is what you need. This channel exists because these stories deserve to be told with care. Because the people who live inside them, who loved honestly and were deceived and had to figure out in the quiet afterward what to do with the loving, those people deserve more than silence. You are not foolish for having trusted. You are not weak for having wanted something real. You are not alone in the grief that doesn't have a ceremony. It shifts, eventually, not back to what it was before, forward into something you couldn't have predicted from inside the hurt, I promise you. All names and identifying details in this story have been changed. This story was created for the Silence Bonds channel and is inspired by real emotional experiences shared publicly. Any resemblance to specific individuals is coincidental.